Okay, stuff happening. Lots of speculation. Putin, Xi, what are they going to do? Xi, maybe just saying to Putin, hey, why don't you hold off on the invasion until after my Olympics are over? I don't want you to steal my thunder. And then go ahead so I can do what I want with Taiwan. Let's take Putin first. A lot of people are saying it's a big bluff. A lot of material for a big bluff.
I don't think it's a bluff. I mean, a bluff implies you're playing a weak hand, right? And he's clearly not, at least relative to the Ukrainians. And I think more to the point, he's taken the measure of this administration and concluded that there's a lot he can get away with. In fact, I already think he's shifted the conversation such that you hear statements coming out of Ukrainian politicians saying, well, maybe we'll give up any future bid to join NATO in order to de-escalate. And by the way, I don't think it should be explicitly part of our policy at present to encourage NATO enlargement. Part of, I think, one category you have to satisfy when you apply to NATO is to have all your territorial disputes settled. That's obviously not the case in Ukraine. I don't think there's any prospect of NATO joining Ukraine in the meantime, but we shouldn't allow Putin to dictate that to us, right? Like, he doesn't get a say in NATO policy. So I don't think he's bluffing. I think this whole thing 72 hours ago that he was withdrawing was a complete head fake. I think he's just looking for some sort of thing that he may manufacture where he can blame the Ukrainians and then invade. What we don't know is whether this is going to be a partial invasion, whether this is going to be the east of Ukraine, whether it's going to be some sort of move on Kyiv. It could be a coup in Kyiv, whether they're just going to take sort of the coastal areas, basically turn Ukraine into a landlocked power and therefore economically irrelevant. I don't know. I'd be guessing if I could speculate, but I think he's going to do something. And the fact that the Biden administration has basically said, we're only going to impose sanctions after the fact, and we've ruled out entirely any military response, has completely undermined our deterrent posture. And so just to connect that quickly to Xi, I think you're right. I think, well, one, we had this 5,000 word statement that Putin and Xi signed based on a meeting they had last week, wherein they talked about, this friendship is ripe for endless cooperation. No areas are off limits. This is very interesting and troubling. After all, these are very strange bedfellows. They were, during the second half of the Cold War, very antagonistic. They have territorial disputes that are temporarily resolved, but there are interests that don't align. But I think they've found they are aligned in undermining the West. And I think Xi is in the very enviable position of being able to sit back and not only watch Putin divide the West further, but also really go to school on the type of warfare that we're seeing play out in Ukraine. I mean, you can think about this as sort of the world's best laboratory for hybrid warfare right now. And as we know, Xi's legacy issue is the forceful reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. And so he gets to sit back and basically assess how the West responds to this crisis, take notes. And I think, if anything, this expedites his timeline for making a move on Taiwan. I think we've entered the decade of maximum danger. And I think particularly after the elections in Taiwan, which are in January of 2024, I think we really enter the window where this could become more likely.
Well, we have 47 questions after what you just said. So, but
I'm too much. I'm sorry.
No, it's just great stuff. Before I hand it over to Peter and Rob, let's just stick with Ukraine and Putin. What he recently said, basically, is it's not only that he doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, he wants states that have been admitted to NATO to be kicked out, right? So he's demanding even more.
Well, and think of what he's already done to Germany, right? A cornerstone of NATO is basically supplicating at Putin's energy altar right now. I mean, it's astounding to see how far. And incidentally, and I don't mean this to be like a Trump versus the anti-Trump forces thing, but remember, one of the chief criticisms of the Trump administration was just how far they were driving our European allies in general and Germany in particular away from us, right? And this was a core thing that Biden campaigned on. It was restoring our alliances, particularly those with Europe. This whole situation has driven Germany further away from certain Western European countries, particularly the Brits. If Nord Stream 2 is allowed to go forward, as the Biden administration opened the floodgates for it to go forward, I see that process continuing. And that is a massive dilemma for the stability and strength of NATO going forward. And we've given Putin so much leverage because of our own counterproductive energy policy in America, which started in week one with the cancellation of Keystone Pipeline. I can't think of something better designed to give Putin a geopolitical gift than us waging war on our own domestic energy production. The whole thing doesn't make sense to me, not just from a conservative perspective, but from a pure geopolitical realpolitik perspective. It makes no sense to me at all. And I'm left to conclude that what's driving those decisions in the Biden administration is the enormous pressure from the left when it comes to climate change. And you see that same pressure screwing up what should be a bipartisan China policy right now, which we can get into if you want, but I'll pause for now because I'm talking to you.
Mike, there is a strategic debate playing out in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. Elbridge Colby wrote a piece the other day saying, China is the whole game. Do not be distracted. The Europeans are rich enough and powerful enough to handle Russia on their own, and they must, because if we send even a small force over there, the attention, the mind space that takes in the Pentagon, the support, the ships, the way that all our forces have to be rejiggered to support guys on the ground, even a very few, relatively small, all right. And then John Bolton answered yesterday saying, wait a minute, these two go together. Any weakness in Europe will only strengthen Xi's hand. We don't have the choice to play only China. We have to face Russia and China at the same time. All right, you have the credentials I just named. You're on one of the committees that's receiving intel briefings, that's in close touch with the administration. Where do you come down?
Well, in true political fashion, I would suggest you could add Bolton to Bridge, divide by 2, and the right policy is probably along those lines. But here's where I think, first of all, let me say, I think Bridge's book, Strategy of Denial, is exceptional. I recommended it in the Wall Street Journal as the best book of the last year. I think it's really an achievement, and full disclosure, I'm friends with Bridge. However, I disagree with him on this specific issue. I think in the same way that we saw the fiasco in Afghanistan and the embarrassing, humiliating surrender in Afghanistan undermined our deterrent posture in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think you could sort of neatly divorce deterrence in Eastern Europe from deterrence in Indo-PACOM. And I think history shows that when we don't aggressively confront small problems, they devolve into bigger problems. And perhaps the best way to undermine our readiness in our priority theater, which to Bridges' point is the Indo-Pacific, and I agree that China is our biggest threat, and I agree that Taiwan is our most important and most stressing defense priority, and that most of our resources should be focused on that problem. So I agree with him in part. However, if we don't use American power in a smart way to lead our allies in Eastern Europe and prevent this crisis from devolving into a broader conflict, I think ironically it could end up consuming more resources, the very resources that Bridge wants to save. And I just would say it should be possible to do this on the cheap because, and this is where Bridge is the evangelist of deterrence by denial, which at its heart is a defensive strategy. We're not seeking to overturn the status quo in Ukraine. No one's proposing to go back into Crimea and take it from the Russians. We have a fundamentally defensive strategy, which has inherent strengths. And we should, if we were smart and if our bureaucracy wasn't broken, we could have armed the Ukrainians to the teeth to allow them to better defend themselves. We could have not allowed the Germans to Finlandize further towards Russia. We could have moved naval assets to the Black Sea. We could have gotten Turkey's permission. There's this weird treaty that, but we could have gotten around it. We could have put in place a lot of things, I believe, that would have forced Putin to back down or not even try this in the first place. And I fear sometimes Bridge, I make this unfair to Bridge, but people that are advocates for not getting involved at all are offering us this false choice between full-scale war with Russia or doing nothing. There are plenty of options in between. For example, this is not going to be a cakewalk for the Russians. I mean, as earlier I said, he's not bluffing. He has a good hand to play, but I don't know of any other time in modern history where a great power, or we could disagree of whether Russia's a great power, but a true military power in a conventional sense is going to go up against armed UAVs like the Russians are. I mean, this is going to be an interesting military problem. And at a minimum, we could have made it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for Putin to achieve his objectives without deploying battalions and battalions of our soldiers, sailors, or airmen that Bridge wants to use in the Pacific, if that makes sense.
Ricochet. Join the conversation.